Hello and welcome. My name is Alan, and we are back with more notable names in Native American history. This will be the last one for 2025. So, to end it off today, we'll be talking about an individual. His native name is Thayendanegea, but he's better known by his anglicized name, Joseph Brant. Typical as is for most Native Americans, the English like to anglicize the name. Yeah. We see this example in a number we have come across already. But anyway, this is from biography. Introduced to colonial culture at an early age. Thayendanegea, also known by his English name, Joseph Brant, fought for the British in the French and Indian War, which means he fought for the British colonies against the French and Indians, which is probably better known as also the 7 Years' War, if you're not familiar with what the French and Indian War is. It goes by two names. One is more well known overseas. I think the 7 Years' War is what it's called overseas. But anyway, for those who are unaware, the French and Indian or 7 Years' War is the conflict that took place before, a few years before the actual revolution itself, and it made George Washington an actual experienced commander. I don't think he had commander rank in the military itself, but he had led enough troops that he was used to doing so. But Brant would convert to Christianity and serve as a missionary among the Iroquois people, and the warrior and scholar remained fiercely loyal to his Mohawk roots and rallied four of the six Iroquois nations to the side of what he felt was the more protective British Empire during the American Revolution. So even though he fought on the side of the British and the colonies during the French and Indian 7 Years' War, he fought with the British against the colonies in the American Revolution. Because he felt, which was often the case, that the British were seen as the more protective, more reasonable side, while the colonists, as was often the case, wanted to continue pushing further west, further west, further west, to take more land, to take more land, to take more land. It's like part of the reason the history of American expansionism is so tragically caught up with the decimation of the native peoples. Brant fought with distinction in several major skirmishes in the New York area, rising to the rank of captain, though he faced a continuous uphill battle in its aftermath as he sought to broker peace and prosperity for his people. This is from the National Park Service. Thayendanegea, or Joseph Brant. He was born a Mohawk and was a man of two worlds. His sister Molly was the common law wife of Sir William Johnson, Superintendent of Indian Affairs for the British. Brant was thus exposed to the English culture, becoming a regular part of the Johnson household while still retaining some ties to the Mohawk way of life. So, yeah, his wife, or his sister Molly, would become the wife to one of the British figures. So, very strongly intertwined with the British, even though he still had strong roots in his Mohawk history personally. 1755, at age 13, he accompanied Sir William Johnson to the Battle of Lake George and observed the negotiations that brought about the Boundary Line Treaty in 1768 at Fort Stanwix. He traveled to England in 1776, met King George III, and voiced his concerns over the colonists' failure to abide to the 1968 Fort Stanwix Treaty, but was assured that the land disputes would be dealt with the war with the colony once the war with the colony is over. I think that's what it's trying to say. Before leaving England, Brant accepted the war belt, meaning that he had decided to support the English king in his family dispute with the colonies, and his actions along with his sister's influence would be a factor that brought about the split in the Six Nations Confederacy. Once home, Brant raised a group of loyalists and Indians. Remember, loyalists are those who were like, no, we shouldn't secede from England. We should stay as colonies. So he's gathering those people along with his fellow native peoples. American General Nicholas Herkimer met with Brant in June of 1777, and they had been neighbors, and for 2 days Herkimer tried to convince Brant to stay out of the war, but Brant refused and reasserted his intention to support the British. These men would meet again August 6th, 1777 at Oriskany, and Herkimer attempted to come to the aid when he attempted to come to the aid of Fort Stanwix. Brant would be on the other side as part of a force that ambushed Herkimer and his militia. So we have an American military leader, one of the colonial generals, who actually, before the revolution, had been a neighbor with Joseph Brant. So they knew each other quite well. And he tried to convince Brant. He's like, please, don't go into this supporting the English. Please stay out. You know, I know who you are. You're a good person. But, yeah, just... Brant made it clear he was going to support the English crown, so... At the war's end, the British gave Brant's people land along the Grand River in Canada in what became known as Brantstown. Today, it is known as Brantford, Canada. Brant often traveled back to the U.S. However, on a trip from Philadelphia, he stopped by the home of Peter Gansevoort, and on another visit, in an ironic twist of fate, Marinus Willett ended up deterring a stalker who had been determined to assassinate Brant. In 1793, he even carried out a mission of peace to the Miami natives on behalf of George Washington, that helped secure peace between the two nations. So even after the colonists won their independence, Brant was like still trying to get peace. And he was respected enough that someone who had tried to assassinate him was stopped. They caught the attempted assassin. So Brant died estranged from both the British and his people, and he had made many enemies as he dealt with land disputes and tried to sell off property to make some money for his people to live by. 43 years after his death, however, his body was carried back to Brantstown, where he was laid to rest beside the Mohawk church. So yeah, despite attempts at peace to make a better future, his name got used to recognize a town, and I think that's about it. Often in American history, you hear of certain native peoples. Brant isn't one of the first one you hear of that comes to mind when you think of natives. So yeah. Let's go with Britannica, because I know it's not that long. Yeah. Anyway, born 1742 on the banks of the Ohio River and died November the 24th, 1807, near Brantford, Ontario, Canada, and was a Mohawk Indian chief who served not only as a spokesman for his people, but also as a Christian missionary and a British military officer during the American Revolution. He was converted to the Anglican Church after 2 years at Moore's Charity School for Indians is what they called it. I hate that was used as the terminology back then, because they weren't Indians. They weren't from India. I know it's because dumbass Columbus thought he was I'm in the East Indies. No, you're a dumbass. In Lebanon, Connecticut, where he learned English and became acquainted with Western history and literature. He left school to become an interpreter for an Anglican missionary and later aided in translating the prayer book and the Gospel of Mark into Mohawk. Brant's sister, Molly, was the wife of the British Superintendent for Northern Indian Affairs, Sir William Johnson, whom he followed into battle at the age of 13. He fought the British in the last French and Indian War, and in 1774 he was appointed secretary to Sir William's successor, Guy Johnson. Guy Johnson was one we spoke momentarily about when we did David Hill. Yeah, I think it was David Hill. So interesting. In 1775, Brant received a captain's commission and was sent to England, where he was presented at court. On his return, he led 4 of the 6 Iroquois nations on the British side to the American Revolution, and attacked colonial outposts in the New York frontiers, while skillfully commanding a native contingent in the Battle of Oriskany, August 6, 1777, and winning a formidable reputation after a raid on the fortified village of Cherry Valley, New York, November the 11th, 1778. Cooperating with the British regulars and loyalists, he brought fear and destruction to the entire Mohawk Valley in southern New York and northern Pennsylvania. He also thwarted an attempt of a rival chief, Red Jacket, to persuade the Iroquois to conclude a separate peace with the revolutionaries. After the war, Brant discouraged further native warfare on the frontier and aided the U.S. commissioners in securing peace treaties with the Miamis and other western tribes. He retained his commission in the British Army and was awarded a grant of land on the Grand River in Ontario, where he ruled peacefully over his followers who settled there. He continued his missionary work, and in 1785 again visited England, where he raised funds for the First Episcopal Church in Upper Canada. But yeah, that's what they have on him. 1742 to 1807. And he was fighting at a young age, 13 years of age. He joined the British to fight. Yeah, Sir William Johnson, he followed into battle at the age of 13. That was 1750s, early 60s, so yeah. Interesting. Now, let's go ahead and see if we can get anything else here from American Battlefield Trust. March 1743 to November the 24th, 1807. Remember, with a lot of these Native American people, unfortunately, we have contradictory or sometimes just scant information on their lives, especially dealing with the dates when things happened and everything. So he was one of the most controversial figures of the American Revolution. Joseph Brant, his Mohawk name Thayendanegea, was born along the Cuyahoga River in 1742. His parents were part of the Mohawk tribe from New York who had traveled to the Ohio Territory to hunt, and his family returned to the Mohawk and Iroquois lands where Brant grew up and where he became a polyglot, a war chief, and a diplomat. Yeah, if I remember right, polyglot just means someone who can speak multiple languages. A number of the founding fathers were known as to be polyglots, well studied and everything. I think they said Jefferson can speak like 5 languages, so yeah. In his early life, the young Mohawk became a favorite of the British and was especially championed by the Superintendent of the Northern Indians of America, Sir William Johnson. 1759, Johnson married Brant's sister, Molly, and the marriage was incredibly advantageous to the aspiring leader. Because remember, Brant would become chief of the Mohawk. Um, Through Johnson, Brant gained connections to the British government and education, and Johnson selected Brant and several other Mohawks to attend Moore's charity school for Indians, a school which would later develop into Dartmouth College. That's interesting. Ivy League school. So, at school, Brant converted to the Anglican faith and learned to read and write English. And while Brant's education in Moores gave him the skill which made him prosperous, most students at Moores were not nearly as successful as Brant. The school's administrators and employees abused their power to force students not deemed the best into massive amounts of manual labor. I always hate those who abuse their power and do things like that. So frustrating. After receiving his education, he returned to Johnson's side during the French and Indian War, and when the war concluded, Brant stayed with his brother-in-law and assisted in running the British Indian Department. During the time, he traveled throughout the Iroquois land mainly as a missionary. Throughout his travels, Brant learned to speak at least 3 languages of the different Iroquois tribes and likely spoke all 6 tribal languages. These early years established Brant as a trusted and respected leader of both natives and settlers. Yeah, the Iroquois was a confederation. In fact, I think it was often just called the Iroquois Confederation. But yeah, multiple tribes that kind of lived together in peace, worked together in northern U.S., New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio regions. Let's see. In 1775, after the battles of Lexington and Concord, the 6 nations met to discuss their role in the burgeoning war for independence. While many advocated for neutrality, almost prophetically, Brant predicted that independence for the colonists meant that the natives across the North American continent would lose their land. Unfortunately, he would be right. Brant's argument, along with Johnson's influence, succeeded in convincing 4 of the 6 nations to fight for the British cause: the Mohawks, Onondagas, Cayugas, and the Senecas. That would leave out what? The Miamis, and I can't remember who the other one is, but yeah. Later in November 1775, Brant traveled to England to discuss native roles in the war, along with land disputes, and during the trip, the British aristocracy came to adore Brant. He made many influential friends, and they showered him with gifts, and the British ruling class, so impressed by him, promised him that the native loyalists would be used in the war. Brant would return to the U.S. in July of 1776 and participated in the British campaign to retake New York. The record of Brant's service is unknown. It is likely he served with General Hugh Percy during the British push through Jamaica Pass in New York, which was a key phase of the Battle of Long Island. The young Mohawk and Percy quickly formed a lifelong friendship. Percy would be the only white man which Brant would remain close with after the war. After the New York campaign, Brant returned to the Six Nations, where he rallied the tribes for war against the colonists. Throughout 1777 and 1778, Brant's forces became exclusively involved in the Mohawk Valley. Brant's army participated in the Battle of Oriskany, in attacks on Cobleskill, and in raids on German flats. While Brant's forces were on a raid, Continental troops attacked Brant's Onondaga base, and the Continentals razed the city, burn it to the ground, leaving buildings burned, cattle dead, and crops reaped. Brant, as a response, led the attack which became known as the Cherry Valley Massacre. During the attack, Seneca forces sought out innocents, killing at least 30 civilians. This action gave Brant a reputation for brutality and the nickname Monster Brant. However, this reputation was entirely undeserved. Brant, although active in the valley, was not present for the Cherry Valley Massacre. Further primary sources from British leaders and Brant show he attempted to contain the Seneca's violence. In 1779, the British had come to respect Brant's command and granted him the rank of captain of the Northern Confederated Indians and promised provisions to his men, but no pay for the native troops. Because of his new salary and wartime's despoiling, Brant became moderately wealthy. This wealth caused jealousy among rival chiefs and even his unpaid volunteers. As a commission to make Brant a colonel came, British colonial officers did not tell Brant in order to preserve his negotiating power with other tribes. In late 1779, the Sullivan Campaign forced Brant and the native resistance out of New York, pushing them back to Fort Niagara. In 1781, the British sent Brant west to the Ohio country. During this campaign, Brant was seriously injured in the leg and forced to recover at Fort Detroit. During this time, the diplomat and warrior continually tried to keep unseen tribes loyal, or Western tribes loyal to the British, even after the Crown's catastrophic defeat at Yorktown. Often considered the end of the war, the Revolution, because I think it was General Wallace surrendered Cornwallis surrendered to Washington. It was at Yorktown. Late in 1782, Brant's troops continued their guerrilla attacks, but achieved few substantial victories. When the War for Independence concluded in 1783, the Treaty of Paris did not acknowledge the 6 tribes or any indigenous groups' independence. The British had failed to accomplish the promise, which prompted many native tribes to join their cause, the protection of indigenous land. Brant would spend the rest of his life fighting for the land rights of his people and other disaffected indigenous tribes in America. His first attempt at protecting the land was forming the Western Confederacy, a group of 30 native nations which agreed to fight for the Fort Stanwix Treaty Line. Brant sought British support in 1785, and while the British compensated Mohawk losses in the war and gave Brant a pension, they refused to join in support of the 30 tribes. Brant and Washington both made attempts at peace. Brant sought a peace treaty, but failed. Washington tried to create a reservation for the Mohawks and gave Brant a large pension, but Brant refused. The American forces overwhelmed the Western Confederacy, resulting in the 30 tribes alliance disintegrating. The rest of his life was spent tangling with American, French, Canadian, and British bureaucracies in an attempt to establish a peace or a place for his people to live. Brant never successfully negotiated a future for his people, although it was through no fault of his own, but rather the differing goals of all the powers involved in the negotiations. Brant died at his home in Ontario on November the 24th, 1807. Since his death, Brant's legacy has been contested by nearly everyone who interacted with him. As the most prominent negotiator and diplomat of northern indigenous peoples during the Revolution, every power active in his negotiations regarded him differently. Brant's legacy, however complicated, can be succinctly summed up by his own last words. "Have pity on my poor Indians. If you have any influence with the great, endeavor to use it for their good." Again, another unfortunately tragic figure, a person just seeking out what would be best, but always being put through the ringer for not always the reward he had hoped for. Yeah, Cuyahoga. Know that because that's where the Cuyahoga River is, where in Ohio they had the actual fire on the lake, on the water. I think it's also where the song "Smoke on the Water" comes from by Deep Purple. Smoke on the water, boom, boom, boom. Yeah. I think it's what it was actually talking about, but married to a Negan Augyatong Sera, 1765, and she would pass away in 1771. And then a Susanna Augyatong Sera. And then a apparently 1779 he married a Catherine Brant, also known as Adowagesion. So he had 3 different wives. His name in Mohawk means he places 2 bets together, which was kind of fitting considering he was trying to make peace with multiple parties, so he would place a bet on each side to say, come to the table, work together. I don't know if I was pronouncing it right, but I was going Thayendanegea. I'm sure I was probably butchering the name. Some of the names I know, like Cuyahoga, like I said, that's a familiar name. It's been mentioned enough. There's Cuyahoga County in northern Ohio, the Cuyahoga River. But I remember they used to talk about it being so polluted. The river itself would just catch fire so easily. So yeah. But yeah, French and Indian War / 7 Years War, American Revolution, and then after trying to keep peace for the native peoples, keep land for the native peoples. But as I've already explained before, there were so many that were just land hungry, ready to go and stake their own claims when it wasn't necessarily their right to do so. But yeah, this ends this episode and ends the series for 2025. As always, educate thyself, think, read, study, learn. Someone tells you something you have trouble believing, ask them to cite their sources. I'll be putting my links and sources in the description box below the video. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you all in the next one. Excuse me. Until then, later.